We will now turn to our next talk by two speakers who will share the podium here. Dr. Kristen Harknett and Dr. Daniel Schneider. They will be talking about workplace technology and worker well-being. They are colleagues here at the California Labor Lab doing very important research, and they're going to share with you some of the information that they've already been able to harvest from their work. But first, let me introduce each speaker. Kristen Harknett is a professor of social and behavioral sciences and a faculty affiliate of the Institute for Health Policy Studies at the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Harknett co-directs the SHIFT project, a large-scale survey and research study of low-wage workers in the service sector, which maps the connections between schedule instability and other working conditions and worker health and well-being. Drawing on her research, Dr. Harknett has provided invited testimony to inform federal, state, and local policy making around fair work week regulations, including the Federal Schedules That Work Act and legislation in California, Washington State, Chicago, Philadelphia, and other localities. Her research also includes examinations of the use of technology and surveillance in the service sector, as well as access to paid sick leave in the service sector workplaces, and gender and racial and ethnic inequalities in working conditions. Now I'll turn to Daniel Schneider. Daniel Schneider is the Malcolm Weiner Professor of Social Policy at Harvard Kennedy School and Professor of Sociology at Harvard University. Dr. Schneider's research focuses on precarious work, social demography, and inequality. As co-director of the SHIFT project, Dr. Schneider has co-led the creation of a novel data set tracking the working experiences of service sector workers. His work examines racial and ethnic and gender inequalities in job quality, the effects of precarious work on the economic security and well-being of workers and their families, and the effects of labor standards on working conditions. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks a lot. It's great to be here with you today. It often feels like Kristen and I need a joint headshot with the two of us in one picture, and it also feels like we could have saved you, Christina, the trouble and just had a single introduction for the both of us. But it's true that we're two different people, and as two different people, we're going to share the time today. I'll begin us setting the background and then talking about some of our data collection, and I'll pass things over to Kristen to present some of our results in the making here. Great. So I just begin with a disclosure. We have no relevant financial relationships with the commercial interest to disclose. But what I do want to disclose to you is that the service sector is large, and then it is, after a serious shock during the COVID-19 pandemic, again, a growing part of the nation's labor force. With workers in the service sector employed stocking store shelves, staffing delivery vehicles, working in pharmacies, in restaurants, in retail, in fast food, all across the country at all times of day. Yet these jobs, so present in our lives and made so visibly essential during the COVID-19 pandemic, have really suffered in terms of their quality over the past several decades. The service sector, in some sense, is the most acute site for a much broader story of a rising precarity of work in America, where a sort of overdetermined set of forces, the forces of declining manufacturing, of declines in unionization, of deregulation in many ways at the federal level, and of the growing forces of financialization and shareholder value, have really resulted in what the political scientist Jacob Hacker, who I know joined us for this conference last year, has described as a great risk shift, in which large institutional actors like employers have really shifted risk from themselves to individual workers and households. We see this in the decline in wages, in the move away from defined benefit pension plans, in unstable and unpredictable work schedules. Indeed, the service sector is really ground zero for many of these most precarious working conditions that a large body of research has shown have really deleterious effects on workers' health and well-being, not to mention their job satisfaction, retention, and productivity. In prior work, we focused quite a bit, as Christina mentioned, on the experiences of just-in-time work scheduling, of limited access to paid sick leave, and the challenges of low wages, and insufficient hours, and volatile earnings for workers in this sector are really well known. But what we all know and have heard, so vividly about today is that this does not describe the full experience of precarious work, in the contemporary American labor market, and especially in the service sector. The sort of popular imagination and increasingly our academic and practitioners' attention is focused on the emergence of new technologies that in many ways promise new frontiers in precarity, but also potentially promise advancements that might be to the benefit of both workers and their employers. These data, though, that really fully describe the experiences that workers face in this sector and the consequences of working alongside these emerging technologies for workers' respect and dignity, as we heard earlier, for their well-being, for their sense of job security, is hard to come by. There's been really terrific, heroic efforts over the last several years to try to marshal this data, to draw on industry-specific case studies, be it retail work or hospitals or trucking, and to sort of look far and wide and search really deeply for any data sources that might be out there, from novel census products that survey firms to private sector consulting reports that try to size the effects and the prevalence of technologies in the workplace. But this remains a challenging area to answer some really fundamental questions about just what kinds of technologies are workers experiencing on the job. We can think about technologies as playing a wide variety of functions. There are those that might be designed to replace human jobs or duties, like automating functions. There are kinds of technologies that might assist existing human workers. And then there are technologies that in some sense have turned upside down the allocation of tasks, reshuffling the work that is done by customers and workers, where self-checkout machines have moved the work of scanning and tallying from paid workers to customers, where on the other side, much of e-commerce has moved the work of selecting products off store shelves from customers to workers. And then we certainly see technology playing the role, it appears, to monitor and surveil workers. While that has always been, or long been, part of the American workplace, these new technologies may foretell a much more constant and invasive kind of monitoring and surveillance at work. But it is difficult to really understand just how much of this in each of these different categories is going on in many workplaces, how it's changing over time, and which workers are experiencing it. It's not just if this technology is in place at work, but what consequence it has. And one of the key consequences that is pointed to in the public sphere and in a lot of academic work is the question of how these introduction of these technologies may shape the jobs that people do and the number of jobs that there are to do. And this is by no means a new concern. I'm sure this is the kind of quote that will appear at least half a dozen times in a conference like ours over the next 2 days. But it is amazing that almost 100 years ago, John Maynard Keynes reflected on this very question of technological unemployment. Now, Keynes, of course, was quite optimistic. He expected that the gains in efficiency would really mean that everyone could work much less and have a much higher standard of living. Of course, the worry is that in our time of high inequality and of a clear pattern of unequal returns to gains in productivity, that relatively optimistic take may really be far too optimistic, and that instead we may face a period in which the few hold on to the gains of productivity from technology, and many others, workers, may really lose out. Now, as we look at changes in workplace employment, particularly in the service sector over the last years. This is pre-pandemic, as you can imagine. What we see is not one of immediate, mass unemployment or of really dramatic declines in jobs. There have been changes. There's some decline in employment, for instance, in clothing stores, some oscillation in general merchandise, but pretty steady growth in grocery stores and in total retail. Of course, there is also some reallocation of jobs. We see, for instance, that the number of employees in the e-shopping and mail order business, the Amazons and other kinds of e-commerce firms of the world, has really dramatically increased over this period of time. What do workers think? What do Americans think is going to happen when it comes to technology and employment prospects? Well, we have seen a number of surveys over the last few years that ask people directly, well, what do you think is going to happen? Within the next 30 years, which of each of the following do you think will happen? Will robots or computers do much of the work done by humans? This is a pre-ChatGPT poll, I want to be clear here. And what you see, or even the type of work you do. This is a sort of classic poll result. On the one hand, people really do believe that technology will fundamentally reshape much of the work that humans do. 82% probably or definitely. The work that they themselves do, certainly much less likely to be replaced. Just 37% believe that will happen. But in general here, what we see are many Americans really coming to the conclusion that technology may well replace some of the work they do, if not their jobs entirely. Now, there is a tendency towards technological inevitabilism, but of course it need not be that way. And we have seen efforts to put guardrails and to make intentional decisions around technology very much, and especially over the last few months as we've seen the pace of some technological advancements really accelerate. On the one hand, there are efforts by unions like UFCW, like SEIU, to ensure that there is bargaining and that there is worker voice in decisions around the deployment of automation and other forms of technology. And it is also possible to set employment laws that might govern these technologies, to sort of set labor standards, rules that help us decide as a collectivity how we might proceed. So as we look across this, today and tomorrow, and across our talk today, we wanted to turn to a couple of key and more applied questions. First, to try to delve some into what are the consequences of the deployment of new technologies in the service sector for job security. There are these big questions around what will happen. Will it eliminate jobs? Will it change jobs? And we do have some evidence on how this plays out. But I think it's important to know that much of this evidence, and some of it quite good, is somewhat circumscribed in terms of the broadness of its applicability. A lot of it is really focused on a period in America that did see the deployment of robots and automation, but industrial robots and automation in particular in auto manufacturing. And this is a pretty, this is a powerful case, but a pretty specific case, one for a specific set of manufacturing blue collar workers, often men, in an earlier time period in a particular part of the country. Today, we want to talk some about just describing the contours of exposure to technology, but also to bring in some new data on how exposure to this kind of technology at work may shape workers' perceptions of their own job and security in a very different sector, in the contemporary service sector. And to do that, we're going to need to marshal some new data, because as you know, very few data sets include direct measures of surveillance, automation, and technology. Little data tracks workers' experiences of exposure to these technologies over time. And it's hard to come by data that includes these measures alongside measures like perceived job insecurity and even employee or worker health and well-being. And then finally, I think what we'll show you is the ability that it's very valuable to look and compare how these processes, that this rollout and these consequences may differ across employers, even within the same sector, to really capture the heterogeneity of these processes. So to do that, I'm going to introduce some new data that we've been collecting through the SHIFT project. The SHIFT project is an ongoing data collection effort that Christina introduced briefly, that Kristen and I run. And our goal is really to build missing survey data, missing in the sense of capturing novel dimensions of job quality that are not often captured in our large-scale data sets, missing in the sense of providing employee-employer linked data, and missing in the sense of taking together measures of job quality alongside measures of economic security, health and well-being, and other important worker-centric outcomes. We build this data using a novel sampling approach, essentially using Facebook's advertising infrastructure as both a sampling frame and a survey recruitment device. We deliver targeted survey recruitment advertisements to workers on Facebook, targeting not young men with Android devices, as I might if I was Verizon, but rather workers at the Home Depot or Starbucks or Costco, or one of about 150 of the largest service sector firms in the country. Workers who see these ads may click through and to take our survey. At that point, they leave Facebook and come to our Qualtrics survey platform. They're asked to consent and then complete about a 20-minute online survey that asks them a whole set of questions that cover many dimensions of job quality, as well as worker health and well-being. We've collected this data over about 13 waves of data collection. We're actually right now in the field with the 14th wave. This is a repeated cross-sectional survey that we field twice a year, basically once in the fall and once in the spring. We're gonna focus today on the data from this national cross-section from wave 7 through 12. This is the period of time when we asked a set of novel measures, which I'll briefly describe, on technology, surveillance, and automation. The data also include these other elements, geographic oversamples designed to facilitate the evaluation of local labor standards effects on job quality and worker outcomes, and nested panel data that allows us to follow individual workers who come in through the national cross-sections longitudinally over time. But in these waves, from the fall of 2019 through to the present, but we'll only go through the fall of 2022, we asked a set of new modules that we developed based on qualitative interviews and cognitive interviewing with workers and review of the literature that asked workers about their experiences with a number of aspects of technology, surveillance, and automation. Monitoring, for instance, inside and outside of work, the deployment of automation technologies, of sales technologies, of technologies that might change the allocation of tasks between customers and workers, as well as a number of other items that we don't see here. For instance, the technologies that might track workers' productivity, the consequences of such tracking, workers' impressions and subjective perceptions of such tracking. So with these data in hand, I'm going to turn things over to Kristen to talk us through some of the results.
So I'm going to turn to our results, and it's just wonderful to be joining and following so many rich presentations that have set the stage. I am going to begin by sharing what we have heard from workers about the prevalence of technology in workplaces across 3 different categories: technology to monitor and surveil workers on the job and off the job, technology, automation, robotics, and then a 3rd category of technology that assists in sales and ordering. So first, I'm going to set the stage by just describing prevalence, because this is something that is fundamental and we don't have a lot of good information on. And then I'll turn to the question that Danny posed about how this is affecting workers and their perceived job insecurity. To set the stage, I'll begin with an account shared with us by a subway crew member who talks about some intense monitoring and micromanagement on the part of their employer and manager. This worker reports that their manager would call and micromanage them to the second, saying things like, don't prep the food like that. You're cutting too much onion off. You're supposed to cut smaller. You have to mix this more, use less sauce. The manager would monitor whether the worker was on their phone, how many paper towels they were using. And the worker said that their manager checked for just about anything. And this kind of monitoring at Subway was done in not the most high-tech fashion, using cameras that were connected to a phone app. But it really gives you a sense for how workers really did feel like they were constantly being surveilled. At least this Subway crew member expressed that. In our survey, we wanted to get a baseline for just how prevalent is this type of monitoring in workplaces. And in our survey wave in the fall of last year, we surveyed about 10,000 workers about how much their employer used technology to monitor what they do at work, their actions, who they're talking to, what they're saying, where they are, and the quality of their work. And what we found is that across these 10,000 workers who were employed by 140 different large retail and food service employers nationally, that monitoring and surveillance on the job was really quite prevalent, that about 75% of workers said that their employer used technology to monitor what they were doing, their actions on the job. Nearly 80% said their employer used technology to monitor the quality of their work. And large shares also said that their employer used tech to monitor their conversations, interactions, and where they were. Even more concerning or alarming is that many workers also expect that their employer monitors their behavior outside of work as well. So when we asked how likely is it that your employer is monitoring what you do even off the job, outside of work, about 25% of workers said that it's at least somewhat likely that their employer is monitoring them outside of work. And when we, to give another account, we see some variation. One of the values of the SHIFT project data collection is we're able to characterize conditions at particular employers and compare and contrast. And so pulling out an account from an Amazon worker, Amazon's a company that's quite famous for their bringing automation to a really extreme level. And this Amazon worker shares that their employer is always harping on those metrics. And we heard earlier, I think from Lisa Kresge, about the metrics monitoring time off task. And this worker really makes it very vivid by saying, all of it adds up. Even when I take a sip of water, that's time off task and it adds up. You take a break of 2 seconds, my employer is tallying and counting. And turning back to our survey data, if we look at Amazon workers in comparison with other retail and food service workers, the percent reporting that their employer uses technology a great deal to monitor their actions, what they're doing at work, you see Amazon really stands out as doing a high level of monitoring. Turning to another type of workplace technology, robotic or automation technology in workplaces. An account from a Chipotle manager expresses some ambivalence about the introduction of robotic technology for delivery, and how, on the one hand, the robots are kind of cool and novel, but on the other hand, they also get in the way. And there's even this story that the manager shares about a robot causing a collision with a cyclist and an injury, and robots getting stuck in the snow. And then in a kind of exasperated fashion says, so like another system. And so this is hinting at the way that some of these new technologies create some friction and perhaps some overwhelm and some inconvenience for workers. But interestingly, when we turn to our survey data, in spite of a lot of sort of hype and alarm and commentary about the coming of robots and potential displacement of human labor, the prevalence of robotics technology in the service sector really isn't that high, with the exception of robots that are used to count the money. But beyond that, the use of robots to stock shelves, for instance, or take inventory really isn't very common in our large sample of service sector workplaces. But returning again to the case of Amazon, that really does stand out as perhaps at the forefront of robotics technology. This coworker at Amazon expresses some anxiety about the possibility that the introduction of robots may displace jobs for their coworkers, and says there aren't many jobs around the building that couldn't be performed by a robot. And so I want to just foreshadow where we're going to go with some of this information, tying it to job insecurity. So robots don't have to be highly prevalent in workplaces to still engender perhaps some fears that my job is going to change, or maybe my job's going to go away. So that's exactly what we were going to be interested in the remainder of this talk. And turning back to our survey data, again, Amazon does stand out in terms of automation, relying more on robots to take inventory and to stock shelves. Descriptively, the third category of technology in workplaces that we'll describe today is technology that's used to assist workers or customers in the sales and ordering process. That is just at the core of retail and food service work and transactions. And there are many different types of sales tech, and I think it's important to make some distinctions between something like a self-checkout device that might be quite threatening to a worker or to a job, that changes a worker's job duties quite a bit, from being the one who's doing the scanning to the one who's standing and playing more of a tech support role. And then on the other hand, as Danny described, at the sort of other end of the reshuffling spectrum, we have online ordering. That's kind of an Amazonification of work for retail workers, where they go from what they used to do on the job to acting more like a fulfillment center worker. And we see that these types of, that type of sales technology is really quite prevalent in the service sector. And when we array and look across industry subsectors, we do see that there's a fair amount of heterogeneity in the Amazonification being very, very prevalent in building supply subsector, places like Lowe's or Home Depot. We see that the self-checkout devices in the red bars are quite common at those same building supply stores, at grocery stores. And in comparison, the lighter gray bars, the robotics technology, any of that is somewhat less common in most of the industry subsectors. So I guess stepping back for a moment, there are some just fundamental and basic descriptive questions that we don't have great answers to, and there are some really pressing data needs for understanding where is this technology emerging and what types of technologies are emerging, and then of course tying it to consequences. We have been collecting this prevalence data since 2019, twice a year. And one thing that's really fascinating is just how little the prevalence has changed over the past 3-year period. So we see really very modest increases in online ordering, e-commerce. We see very modest increases in any robotic technology, that automation at work, and in self-checkout in the red line. And so that's all to sort of set the stage descriptively. There's a lot of heterogeneity both in the types of technologies that are being deployed in workplaces, where we're seeing them, but there isn't a whole lot of increase overall over time. But this lack of increase in prevalence over time may conceal a connection between the places where the technology has emerged and workers' feelings of job insecurity. So that is what I'll turn to in our remaining time. So we asked workers in our survey, thousands of them twice a year, whether they expected that their job duties would be replaced due to technology in the next year, in the next 5 years, or over their lifetime. And you can see that in the left panel, there isn't much change over time, but a substantial minority of workers do anticipate that their duties will be replaced by technology. And then as the time frame gets longer, So does the report of that expectation. And then somewhat smaller shares are anticipating that their job will be entirely replaced due to technology in the next year, 5 years, or over their lifetime. So next, we're going to put these pieces together and to see whether the types of technology that has begun to emerge in workplaces affects workers' anticipation that their duties or their jobs may be replaced. Starting with robotic automation in workplaces, we see a pretty consistent pattern where the workers who are reporting seeing robots and automation around them in some capacity in their workplaces are more likely to anticipate that their job duties are going to be replaced or that their entire job will be replaced eventually. And so what we're looking at here are percentage point increases. So for instance, if I see a robot at my workplace, it increases the likelihood that I think my job duties will be replaced by about 13 percentage points and increases the chance that I think my whole job will be replaced by 9 percentage points. And we can see that same pattern here depicted visually, where in pink, we see workers who say there's no robotics in my workplace, and in the darker dots, those are the workers who report that they do see robots in their workplace. And so with the introduction of automation, we see an elevation in job insecurity in anticipation that your duties or your whole job may be replaced. Turning to the reliance on technology for ordering and for sales, we see that that too increases workers' perceived insecurity. Workers' expectation that their duties or their job may be replaced go up when their workplace starts relying on self-checkout, online ordering, and other technologies. And so we can depict that again visually in pink. Those are the workers whose workplaces still do things the old-fashioned way. And in the darker dots, those are the workers who are starting to see some technology changing the way that ordering and sales happens in their workplace. With the introduction of those sales technologies, we see more anticipated job insecurity for workers. And when we focus in on a particular dimension that we think might be especially threatening to workers, the introduction of these self-checkout kiosks, that especially escalates perceived job insecurity. And finally, if we draw the line, just to make one more connection to downstream outcomes for workers, we see that the anticipation that either your job duties or your entire job is eventually going to be replaced by technology leads to elevated levels of psychological distress for workers, greater reports of being unhappy, and worse sleep quality. So just to wrap up, with the SHIFT project data collection infrastructure that we have in place to monitor job quality, we are able to give some just estimates of the prevalence of different types of automation and technology that are being deployed in workplaces. From our survey, we see very widespread reports of employer monitoring and surveillance. So some of the anecdotes or vignettes that we're hearing are not just one-offs. We see a lot of monitoring and surveilling of workers minute to minute at their workplaces, which of course has consequences for intensification of work and stress and perhaps discipline and many of the things that were well foreshadowed in this morning's presentations. We see heterogeneity both across employers and across industries in what types of technologies are being deployed and relied upon, but overall a pretty slow pace of change since 2019. So I think a lot of the action is really between employers and between industries rather than, year to year rapid rises in these technologies in the service sector. And To sum up the connections that we make between technology and job insecurity, in spite of the fact that the pace of change has been relatively slow, the anticipation of future job changing or job losses due to technology is real in its consequences. We can trace a connection between the presence of technology and workers experiencing more feelings of insecurity, more distress. And so in real time, it is affecting worker well-being. I'm out of time, and tomorrow we're going to hear all about new frontiers for labor policy and protection. And we heard some about this morning, but I think there's a lot of important policy making work to be done, thinking about protecting employees' data, their data privacy. There's been local and federal legislation, either passed or proposed, and we've seen unions taking action and trying to mandate disclosure and notice before technological changes transform jobs. And we've heard in earlier presentations and from union reps about the wild, wild west and the urgency to just really get a handle on the landscape and to pass some protections and guardrails. So it's been wonderful to be part of this, and I look forward to the discussion and the rest of the talks.
Thank you so much for such an informative presentation by both of you. It's certainly adding to everything that we've heard so far today. Really, again, getting ground level views of the impact of technology, automation, and just the fears rolling into health and well-being consequences as a function of just seeing the technology being introduced into their work sites. So let me encourage people to put in the Q&A your questions, but since we don't have a queue yet, I get to ask the first question, if you don't mind. There actually was a question a little earlier that was put in the chat, and I will just throw it out there since I know the two of you have thought about this question quite a bit, and that is about the representativeness of the sample that, even though it's 10,000 persons working, what's the representativeness of the findings that you just presented? Is there a way of checking whether, or even thinking about what segment or segments of the population are not included here, and would you find out anything different?
Sure, so I can begin, and then Danny, you can add, I'll welcome you to add in too. But we've been at this since 2016, and we only had a half hour today, and we're really happy to share much more information with those who are interested in it. We've done a ton of benchmarking with nationally representative data sources to the extent that our data overlaps with those sources. So we can benchmark on wages and paid sick leave, and we find that our database really closely resembles probability data sets and administrative records data sets whenever we do that kind of benchmarking. We take lengths to weight our data, to adjust for any skews, and we target workers both on Facebook and Instagram, because I think Instagram is a younger demographic and Facebook is a somewhat older demographic. But so I think that our data are well represent the conditions in the service sector. Now, of course, there is a digital divide and limited English proficiency. You know, there are some workers who will not be represented in our data set. I think that's true of most survey data collection. And I think that's an important caveat. But when we're thinking about characterizing conditions in the sector, we feel confident that our data do reflect conditions well.
So that's great, because you're sampling such a wide range of people, even though it's within social media. And it's quite a unique data set, I must say, and kudos to you to come up with this strategy, because it gives us all hope that we can do something other than maybe Mechanical Turk. So another question just to throw out to you, which is there a possibility that when you collected data back in 2017 and you caught what was the probability that people would have their jobs changed or they would be eliminated and so on, did that ever track with what actually happened in those organizations that where the respondents were from? I know it's not a one-for-one, hey, I think I'm going to lose my job, and in fact that person did lose their job, but on a more general, higher level scale, is there a way of looking at the validity of those predictions?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think there's two ways to think about it. On the one hand, job insecurity itself is an important state of being. That is to say, it is a kind of uncertainty that we know really weighs on people and diminishes their health and well-being. So in a sense, we don't need people to be accurate forecasters of their employment fates to care that working alongside this technology makes people feel very insecure about their job futures, because that matters then in turn for their well-being. Now, are people good predictors of their fates? This is an interesting question, actually. In these data, we do have the capacity to follow individual workers over time. It's not data we shared with you today, but the folks who come into our cross-sectional data that we shared with you, we then follow for not for long, for 6 months to 2 years. And that does allow us to see if people change jobs. Now, people change jobs all the time in the service sector. It is a really high turnover sector, as you all know. And so it's important to, to keep that in mind. Folks may also not have a clear sense of why they lose their jobs, or it may be that technology pushes people out of jobs, even if their jobs may have remained there because it's unpleasant to work alongside or a source of stress or uncertainty. And so these are complicated dynamics that disentangle, but ones that I think there is some potential to take a look at.
Yeah, that's it's a great answer. And when we think about what is happening pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic, where there's a lot of uncertainty, period, about what's going to happen in the future, and then laying on top of it the impact of technology and automation on jobs, we don't really know where this is going. So let me just ask your opinion. Where do you think this is going? They're trying not to answer this question.
I feel like the motivation for our project is we need data to monitor where things like this emergent job conditions, and the California Work and Health Survey, which we'll hear about as well, which is part of this center. I think the whole purpose is that we don't want to have to guess or speculate. We want systematic information. And, I think the wild, wild west characterization is apt, that there's a lot of variation that we have just scratched the surface on being able to understand. And so I think this convening is gonna, help us make some strides, but I think we just need to continue to, pool together all the researchers and all the data sources we can to really understand where this is headed.
I think you're right. Lots to understand, and nothing like good data. So thank you so much for your excellent presentation. I always enjoy listening to your presentations. I learned so much. It's just, it's great work. So thank you very much. And we will now take a break